Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack one of the absolute most monumental chapters in Indonesian history. We're diving deep into the life, the leadership, and the really incredible enduring legacy of Prince Diponegoro, along with the devastating Java War that he led. This is an epic story of fierce resistance, deep spirituality, and a massive clash of civilizations that quite literally reshaped the entire Indonesian archipelago. Let's get right into it. 5 years. Now, I know 5 years might not sound like some massive, multi-generational historical epic, but this single, brutal half-decade of conflict against Dutch colonial rule was so incredibly intense that it actually nearly bankrupted entire Dutch Empire. It became the longest, deadliest, and most expensive war the Dutch ever fought on Javanese soil. It was a real game-changer that forever altered the course of Indonesian history. But to really wrap our heads around this war, we first have to understand the man who actually led it.
What's honestly so fascinating to me is his background. I mean, imagine being offered a literal kingdom and just going, no thanks, because that is exactly what he did. Born Raden Mas Antowidio back in 1785, Diponegoro was the eldest son of the Sultan. But since his mother was a concubine and not the primary queen, he wasn't directly in line for the throne. Yet even when he was later offered the crown anyway, he outright refused it. He wanted no part of that toxic court politics. Instead, he chose to live a highly spiritual life in an estate called Tigo Rejo, raised by his great-grandmother. He basically grew up outside the palace walls, fully immersing himself in religion, philosophy, and just everyday life right alongside ordinary commoners and Islamic scholars.
And that uniquely grounded upbringing, it profoundly shaped his public image. Because he lived right there among the peasantry and was a deeply devout Muslim, the Javanese people didn't just see him as some out-of-touch elite royal. They felt a really profound connection to him. In fact, he essentially became the living embodiment of the Ratu Adil, the just king. In Javanese mythology, the Ratu Adil is this powerful messianic figure, prophesied to arrive during times of great darkness to deliver Java from tyranny and suffering. And believe me, during the 1820s, the people of Java were definitely suffering.
By the 1820s, all this underlying tension had built to an absolute boiling point, largely fueled by 3 massive factors. First up, you had extremely aggressive colonial interference. Dutch officials were just heavily meddling in internal royal affairs. Second, there was this crushing economic exploitation. We're talking heavy taxes on peasants, restricted land leasing, and strict monopolies that absolutely impoverished the local population. And finally, blatant cultural disrespect. Diponegoro watched as Dutch influence crept further into the palace, corrupting traditional Javanese values and Islamic morals. The whole atmosphere was incredibly volatile.
So, picture the scene. We have a deeply impoverished, oppressed population, a corrupt colonial administration, and a highly respected spiritual prince just living quietly on the outskirts. The powder keg is packed to the brim. But what was the match? What specific event finally pushed this peaceful spiritual prince to take up arms, step fully into the role of the just king, and declare an all-out holy war against colonial rule?
Well, the answer lies in the Tegal Rejo incident of early 1825. Dutch authorities, working with a pro-Dutch court official, decided they were going to build a new road. But they didn't just build it anywhere. Without asking for Diponegoro's consent, or even telling him, they ordered wooden stakes to be driven directly through his estate in Tegal Rejo. And to make matters infinitely worse, the proposed route cut right through a sacred ancestral graveyard. I mean, it was the ultimate display of disrespect. They crossed a massive red line.
The escalation after that was immediate, and it was fierce. Diponegoro's loyal supporters didn't just write a strongly worded letter of complaint. No, they went out, yanked up the Dutch wooden stakes, and defiantly drove spears into the ground in their place. When the Dutch demanded Diponegoro's arrest for this, he absolutely refused to surrender. In response, on July 20th, 1825, Dutch troops launched a full-scale assault on his residence, burning the whole thing to the ground. Diponegoro and his followers narrowly escaped into the countryside, and it was right there, literally amidst the ashes of his home, that he declared a holy war, a jihad, against colonial rule. The Java War was officially on.
What followed was just a fascinating, brutal tactical chess match. On one side, you have Diponegoro utilizing these highly effective Javanese guerrilla tactics. His forces would strike rapidly out of nowhere and then completely vanish into Java's dense jungles and mountains. Traditional European armies literally could not catch them. On the flip side, Dutch General de Kock realized his forces were bleeding out, so he developed what was called the Benting Stelsel, or fortress system. This basically meant building a massive, suffocating network of small forts all across Java, connected by secure roads, to slowly but surely box the rebel forces in.
But before the Dutch forts could fully tighten their grip, Diponegoro found some major early success by putting together a truly incredible, unified coalition. You've got Prince Diponegoro himself acting as the vital spiritual and political figurehead, uniting aristocrats and peasant farmers alike. Then you have Kiai Mojo, a prominent Islamic scholar who brought intense religious legitimacy and fervor to the whole movement. And handling the actual battlefield was Sentod Ali Basha, this brilliant young military commander who was orchestrating those devastating guerrilla strikes. It was just a perfectly balanced command structure.
But you know, momentum like that is incredibly hard to maintain. The war kicked off in 1825, but by 1828, the grim reality of that Dutch fortress system was really setting in. The forts were successfully choking off the rebellion's mobility and totally severing their supply lines. Naturally, this led to severe resource shortages, which then caused internal fractures. Ideological disagreements led to Kiai Mojo surrendering, and eventually the brilliant commander, Sintod Ali Basha, who was completely out of troops and supplies, actually defected to the Dutch. By 1830, the alliance was in pieces, the civilian population was devastated by famine, and the stage was set for a truly tragic conclusion.
Which brings us to one of the most treacherous and somber moments in colonial history. March 28, 1830. Diponegoro's army was severely depleted at this point. Under the strict, agreed-upon guarantee of safe passage during the holy month of Ramadan, which is a time when fighting is traditionally strictly forbidden, Diponegoro agreed to meet General de Kock in Magelang to negotiate peace terms. But when Diponegoro stood his ground and demanded to be recognized as the religious leader of Java, General de Kock blatantly broke the truce. In a stunning act of treachery, he had the prince arrested right there on the spot. That arrest effectively ended the war. But the human cost of this conflict, it was utterly staggering. 200,000. That is the estimated number of Javanese lives lost during this 5-year rebellion. To put that into perspective for you, that single conflict wiped out roughly 7% of Java's entire population at the time. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and the landscape was just ravaged by the warfare and the terrible famine that followed.
The colonial forces definitely did not walk away unscathed either. The Dutch and their local allies suffered massive casualties, losing around 15,000 soldiers themselves. Like we talked about at the beginning, this cemented the Java War as the longest, deadliest, and most expensive war the Dutch had ever waged on Javanese soil. The sheer scale of the blood spilled and the money spent was completely unprecedented for the colonial administration.
So, because the war nearly bankrupted the Netherlands, the Dutch administration had to figure out a way to urgently recover their financial losses. Their solution in 1830 was the cultuurstelsel, or forced cultivation system. This was a wildly oppressive policy that forced Javanese farmers into hard labor, requiring them to dedicate a massive chunk of their own land and time to growing export crops specifically for the Dutch crown. It was an absolutely brutal economic extraction system, designed to squeeze wealth out of a population that had literally just been decimated by a 5-year war.
As for the man who started it all, he was removed from the board entirely. 25 years. That is how long Prince Diponegoro spent in exile. After his betrayal and arrest in Magelang, he was deported to Manado in North Sulawesi and then later transferred to Fort Rotterdam in Makassar. He spent a quarter of a century, the entire remainder of his life in captivity, miles and miles away from his homeland, before finally passing away in 1855 at the age of 69.
But here is the amazing part. Diponegoro did not let his voice be silenced by exile. Not at all. During those long, isolated years, he accomplished something astounding. He wrote the Baba Diponegoro. This is a monumental 700-page epic autobiography written entirely from memory in traditional Javanese verse. It meticulously details his early life, his profound spiritual visions, and his own first-hand account of the history of Java. It's a work of such immense cultural and historical importance that today it is officially recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Document. They imprisoned his body, for sure, but his mind and his story were preserved forever. And that preservation is exactly why we are still talking about him today. Diponegoro's legacy goes so far beyond his ultimate military defeat. In modern Indonesia, he is a towering symbol of national unity, profound sacrifice, and fierce anti-colonial resistance. If you travel across Indonesia right now, you are going to see his name gracing major streets, esteemed universities, military divisions, and grand monuments. He is immortalized as a foundational hero of the nation.
This whole remarkable history leaves us with a truly provocative thought to wrap up on. How does a devastating military defeat, a tragic betrayal, and a lost war ultimately become the very foundation of an entire nation's identity? I think it shows us that true victory isn't always found on the immediate battlefield. Sometimes, the willingness to fight against totally impossible odds, to sacrifice everything for the idea of freedom and justice, plants the seed. And that seed, nurtured by stories like the Baba Diponegoro, eventually gives birth to the unbreakable spirit of a nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the history that shapes our world.